Hello and welcome to another very exciting lecture for behavioral neuroscience. In this lecture we are going to do part 1 of 2 of the structure of the nervous system. We are going to talk about the brain, we are going to look at various parts of the brain, we are going to get into detail about the brain. Before we get to that, let me play this video. And even to me, this is what it sounds like sometimes when someone is talking about the brain. There's a long lead up to this that I couldn't cut out.
Well, the Cots and the Tempertones murk the glucoses and overclock the Mergerchuses. There's the Venus Grisabon and part of Isocruise. Together, T-mood sliver the antipedity, so fourth frame shows data vision and auditory slow perfection. Resulting friction induces corresponding blip mortalizers, but that all comes under Kroner's electropulmonary saltification, which you will underline in our professor course. Now, resonatory friction and multicentric compulators superless the alleviating Dutch immediately lubble Dutch, making contace and together slib temperance and expectancy. Our reflection inertia corresponds to Hugo Bavertz's supercredited valence multiplicatory equation, E equals 2R. I'll say that again, E equals 2R, where R is the radiance of a home measure of the Valdry effect. And providing Pavini stems of parabolic and paraceltin reflector lucidity overleases the homovesery and heterovandal effect, so that neglectance of Mermat's atmospheric supercontraction causes structure mention of faction cavity there. So don't eat them.
Don't feel bad if you couldn't understand anything that was being said there, except a few words here and there, of course. That was intentional. The point is that there is a lot of terminology when it comes to dealing with the brain, and we are only going to hit the surface of it, not just the surface of the brain, but the surface of the terminology as we go through this chapter. As we go through the later chapters, we'll get even more in depth. That being said, with that one, this one is a much better video, a much lighter video.
And now, the parts of the brain, performed by the brain.
Yes. Neocortex, frontal lobe,
Brainstem,
hippocampus, neural node, right hemisphere, pons and cortex, visual,
brainstem,
Sylvian Fisher, pineal, left hemisphere, cerebellum left, cerebellum right, synapse, hypothalamus, striatum, dendrite. Axon fibers, matter gray,
brainstem,
central tegmental pathway, temporal lobe, white core matter, forebrain skull,
brainstem,
central fissure, cord spinal, parietal, diameter, meningeal vein, medulla oblongata and lobe limbic, microelectrodes, the brain. That ought to keep the little squirts happy. Yeah.
Okay, much more light and amusing. Okay, let's get into the chapter itself. So in this chapter, we're going to talk about planes and orientation. What we mean there is we're looking at the different angles you can look at the brain. Then we'll look at the central nervous system again, but look at it in more detail. We'll look at the meninges, the ventricles, the spinal cord, and then in part 2, we will go into in-depth into the brain. And then in this one, we'll still do the peripheral nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. So what does this mean? If I say ventral posteromedial nucleus of the thalamus, what does that mean? And actually, almost all of that is something that you should, by the end of this lecture, or in the end of the next few slides, be able to identify what most of that means. Because a lot of that is stuff when we're talking about the planes and orientation of the brain. It's basically talking about locations. Instead of using up, down, left, right, northwest, east, south, we use other terms when we're defining the brain, such as the term ventral. Let's get to those. So first, when we look at the brain, we're looking at cross sections of the brain. We're looking at different ways we can cross-sect it. And there are many different planes that we can cross-sect the brain with. And in the next few slides, we'll talk about the different planes that we can cross-sect it with. But when you do this cross-section, you get a view of what's going on inside. And these cross sections, they might occur at the midpoint, they might occur farther forward, farther back, but you're basically getting a view of what's going on inside the brain. And all of these things you see in this slide we'll discuss as we go through. But one important thing to look at with this is that, and we'll talk about later, you do get a chance to see these fissures that are in the brain, and how these fissures are, how the brain, the surface of the brain, it has wrinkles on it that allow for the more surface area. This is a sagittal view. So a sagittal view is where you do a cross section from the side. The mid-sagittal is at the midpoint of the brain, where it's cutting the brain in half from left to right. Now, in this one, you can see all of these different components. We're going to talk about most of these in this lecture. Other ones we'll talk about in other lectures, but it's basically showing how you can see all of the components now. Now that we've looked at those two, when we just look at them as an overview, let's actually look at the planes of the brain. So we've got a few different planes to worry about. We've got horizontal planes, we've got vertical planes, we've got the sagittal planes. So the sagittal plane is going to be this one here, that cuts the brain from left to right. The horizontal is there, that cuts it from top to bottom. And then the vertical is there, that cuts it from front to back. However, we don't use the terms top and bottom, front and back, left and right. We use these other terms that you can see here that we're actually going to get to as we get into the various different things in this slide. But when one term we use is when you're looking from the front, we're talking about the coronal view. The front is the coronal. When you're looking top down, you're looking at the horizontal view. And when you're looking sagittal, you're looking from the sides, and divides them into hemispheres. Now, that being said, you see some other terms on this set of slides. We're going to talk about those on the next, but again, we don't use those terms top and bottom, left and right. I've been using those to this point because that's what you know, but after this, I'll start using these other terms for it. So, this here is again showing that zoomed in, but we're looking at now what the front, back, top, bottom, all of those are. So one set of terms we use is superior and inferior. Superior is going to refer more to the top. Superior is the top. So you see superior up here. Inferior is the bottom. So superior and inferior. So if something is talking about the superior something in the brain, it's the top. Inferior something in the brain, it's the bottom. Now, it doesn't just mean that it's in the bottom half. It just means if you've got something that's a cluster, let's say in here, and it's split in two, the superior will be the top half of it, the inferior will be the bottom half. Other terms that you see, because you see here dorsal and ventral are there as well, but dorsal and ventral refer to top and bottom as well, but they also refer to front and back. So dorsal, when we're talking about the brain, not the brain stem, but the brain, dorsal refers to the top. The ventral, when you're talking about the brain, not the brainstem, refers to the bottom. When you're referring to the brainstem and the hindbrain, when we get to that, the ventral is the front and the dorsal is the back. Why is that the case? Because if you look at animals that don't walk on 2 legs, animals that walk on 4 legs, their brainstem comes out the back, not the bottom so much. Especially when you look at things like, let's say, alligators. Your book uses alligators as an example. Their brainstem comes out the back, and the dorsal part of the brainstem is still up. The ventral part of the brainstem is still down. So dorsal is the back or top. So top or back. So the back of your body or the top. The ventral is the bottom or the front of your body. And then the final two to talk about is anterior and posterior. Sometimes you'll hear this rostral and caudal. These are referring to front and back. So anterior is the front of the brain. Posterior is the back of the brain. So anterior is towards the nose. Posterior is towards the tail when you're talking animals that are on 4 legs. Relating to those, you have some other orientation features. First is if something is medial, that means it's closer to the middle or the midline of the brain. The closer you get to the middle of the brain, the more medial something is. Versus lateral is the closer to the outer portions of the brain. And so if something is said to be medial, it's closer to the brain than the portion of it that's lateral. And a couple things that go with lateral, you've got ipsilateral. Ipsilateral is referring to structures on the same side of the body. Contralateral is referring to structures on opposite side of the body. So the brain mostly works in a contralateral way, meaning the left hemisphere of the brain controls the right side of the body, and the right hemisphere of the brain controls the left side of the body. That is not 100% universal, but it is, for the most part, the majority of the body works in a contralateral way. So let's go back to this. You've got the ventral, posteromedial nucleus of the thalamus. We've actually just explained some of these. We explained that ventral means lower, so it's the lower portion. Postero means back. So this isn't directly related to the ones we talked about before, but we talked about posterior. So posterior, postero, is back. Medial is towards the midline. We just talked about that. So we've got something that's the lower back middle. Then the nucleus is going to be a group of neurons. Any nucleus, when we're referring to a part of the brain, is a group of neurons. So this isn't referring to the nucleus of a cell. This is referring to a nucleus of an area. That's always going to be a group of neurons. So later on, we might mention that. We might bring that up. We might say, like when we're talking about the spinal cord or various different things, the nucleus of that is going to be the group of neurons. The thalamus, which means chamber. So the thalamus is a chamber. It's Latin meaning chamber. That's something we'll talk about later. So now we have all the portions of this. So what it basically translates into is it's a group of neurons in the lower back middle portion of the brain that looks like a chamber. So the ventral posteromedial nucleus of the thalamus. So as a reminder, we talked earlier last week about the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. As a reminder of that, the brain and the spinal cord are part of the central nervous system. These are things that are encased in bone. So the peripheral nervous system is not encased in bone. The central nervous system is encased in bone. The spinal cord is encased in the spine. The brain is encased in the skull. The peripheral nervous system, things we're going to talk about with this, is the cranial nerves, the spinal nerves, and the peripheral ganglia. So these are the different types of nerves and different areas that we are going to talk about as we go through this. Before we get in too far, when we are talking about the nervous system, we are referring to what you see here. You've got all of the different nerves, neurons that are going through. You've got how the spinal cord is working. You don't see them all going to the peripheral on this. This is more of the central, but it's still part of the peripheral. But you can see all the parts here, all the components that we are going to get to when we start talking. Like even on the next slide when we're talking about it, that we're going to start talking about the meninges that you see up here. We're gonna talk a little bit about when we talk about the brain and spinal cord. We're going to talk about the opening into it. We'll look at things like our cranial nerves and how they start from the brain and proceed to the back of the neck. Then down from there, you've got the spinal cord. Better would be to draw it like that. So all of this is stuff that we will be looking at as we look through this chapter. Let's look at the meninges. So the meninges are the outer covering of the central nervous system. You saw it on that last slide. There is a cover. They're basically a cover over the brain. We'll talk about that on the next slide, but there's actually 3 layers over the brain and 2 layers over the spinal cord of meninges. So it's a multi-layer system covering the central nervous system. Then we'll talk about the ventricles, which are responsible for creating and transporting cerebral spinal fluid, CSF. You'll hear me call it CSF quite often, or just spinal fluid, but it's cerebrospinal fluid is what's produced and transported through the ventricles. And the ventricles are a large portion of the brain, but we'll talk about that later too. Then there is the spinal cord. And the spinal cord, pretty self-explanatory, transfers information between the brain and the peripheral nervous system and is responsible for simple reflexes. So things that come into the spinal cord, but when you react so fast that the brain doesn't have time to process, those simple reflexes are basically processed by the spinal cord itself. And then finally, the part of the central nervous system that we'll be talking about in part 2 is the brain. So the brain is the actual bulk of this chapter. So part 2 is going to just refer to the brain. So we're going to talk about the central nervous system, and we'll actually get into the peripheral in this one, but the majority of the brain is going to be talked about in part 2. So the meninges, I've said these a few times. As I said, it's a layer that protects the brain. It is a coating, and it's actually multiple different layers. So you've got, first on the outside, you've got the dura mater. The dura mater is almost leather-like. It's a hard outer layer that is the protective layer. Then below that, you've got the arachnoid membrane. It's called the arachnoid membrane because it has a bunch of basically protrusions coming off from it that look like spider legs. And the arachnoid membrane is this outer layer you see here, and then off from that is all these protrusions. These protrusions are the subarachnoid space. So this isn't counted as a layer, this is just counted as a space that's part of the arachnoid, because the arachnoid membrane is on the outside of that, and then the protrusions coming off from the arachnoid membrane are considered part of it. So this is this layer there, this gap, it's a space, the subarachnoid space, and it's filled with CSF. It's filled with spinal fluid. And then on the inside of that, you've got the pia mater, and that is basically contains all the blood vessels that carries nutrients to the central nervous system. So this is a weaker area, but it's the nutrient area. It's carrying nutrients to the central nervous system, to the brain and spine. And then, of course, under that, you've got the spine of the brain. So you've got this dura mater, we'll put in purple. You've got the arachnoid membrane in red with the subarachnoid space under it, and then we'll finally make the pia mater green under that. So all of that together is makes up the meninges, if I can actually say it today. Next, let's talk about the ventricles. So the ventricles, if you remember what I said just a little bit ago, the ventricles are responsible for the creation, the production, and transportation of cerebral spinal fluid. So when we're talking about the ventricles, so they produce and contain cerebral spinal fluid. The brain floats in this bath of cerebral spinal fluid within the subarachnoid space, which basically gives the brain protection. The brain can be very easily damaged, but because of this bath of cerebral spinal fluid, when we have blows to the head and things like this, it reduces the potential damage to the brain. And this is important, because the brain floats in cerebral spinal fluid, it actually makes the brain lighter. The brain doesn't push down on the spinal cord and the brainstem as hard as it could, because it's basically about 1/10 of the weight is coming down as is actually the brain. It's coming down on that. There's still that still has to be distributed to other parts. So the neck does take in all of the weight that's on your head, but as far as the brainstem itself and the spinal cord itself, you're only getting about 10% of the weight of the brain taken up by that. Okay, let's look at these ventricles. There is basically 4 classifications of ventricles. There's going to be, essentially, you've got the 2 lateral ventricles, and these 2 lateral ventricles are basically the first and second ventricles. You don't refer to them as the first and second, but they are the first and second ventricles. So the first 2 ventricles are the lateral ventricles. Then these are basically where all the cerebral spinal fluid is produced. So you see those here and here. It helps if I'm in red. You see them here and here. Then below that, or kind of in the middle some, you've got the third ventricle. The third ventricle is basically, it produces more spinal fluid, but it moves it from the lateral ventricles towards where it needs to go. Then you've got the cerebral aqueduct that you see here, which is just basically a tube. You see it here as well. This tube then transports the cerebral spinal fluid between the third and fourth ventricle before you get down to the fourth down here. So the fourth ventricle And this fourth ventricle makes even more spinal fluid. And then from there, it goes into what's referred to as the central canal. The central canal isn't on this, but the central canal then takes the cerebral spinal fluid from the fourth ventricle and diffuses it into the central central nervous system, to the arachnoid layer. And then once it's in the arachnoid layer, it works as that cushion. The body does reabsorb some of it as more is produced. So it's basically a constantly refreshing thing. So looking at that another way, you've got basically these ventricles that are producing cerebral spinal fluid. They are produced, it starts here, it goes this way, it then goes this way, it then goes down in, and finally it is distributed throughout the brain and throughout, and then as it's going throughout, it's reabsorbed into the body some. So this is where cerebrospinal fluid production, distribution, reabsorption. We're talking about the spinal cord next. So the spinal cord, you've got a couple different looks of it here. On the left, you've got a full spinal cord. On the right, you've got one broken down where you've got dissections of it. It is a long tube-like structure. It distributes motor fibers to the effector organs of the body, the glands and the muscles, and collects the somatosensory information for the brain. So it is the part of the body that takes in information from the senses, with the exception of the eyes, takes in the information from the senses and transports that information to the brain. It also takes information from the brain and distributes it out to the muscles and the glands. It contains some reflex circuits. These are the reflex circuits we were talking about before, where some of those reflex circuits are in there, and they basically circumvent need for information to go all the way to the brain. And it's composed of a vertical column, 24 individual vertebrae, fused vertebrae, and spinal roots. So all of those together count together. And basically, you can see when you look at it, this outer layer over here is the dura mater. Then inside that, you've got the arachnoid membrane. Then inside that, you've got the pia mater. So they're all there. It's not as thick. The arachnoid layer isn't as thick, but it is all there. From the top, you can see white matter and gray matter, as we'll talk about them later. And we'll even look at things like dorsal, ventral, and spinal nerves. So you've got the roots, the front and back roots, you've got the spinal nerves, you've got all of these coming off from the spine. Next, let's look at the peripheral nervous system. So if you haven't noticed, I've been going over some of these in more general terms. That is because I can get way more specific. I can talk about all the different parts that are on all these different pictures. Your book is pretty good for that. If I throw all these terms at you and say, this is this, 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 that's all I'm going to be doing. It's pretty much all I'm doing right now, but at least I'm not throwing 400, 500 terms at you in this chapter. So just be aware that I'm shortening it some so that you get a chance to absorb the more important information. Let's look at some of those things we were talking about from the previous one, though. So we're going to talk about the peripheral nervous system now. And when we talk about the peripheral nervous system, we're going to talk about the two components of the peripheral nervous system. First is the somatic nervous system. The somatic nervous system is the voluntary portion of the peripheral nervous system. This is the portion of the peripheral nervous system where you have conscious control over. When you're talking about movement that you have to actually move yourself by thinking about. Now, we can do things without really consciously thinking about it, but it's still part of the somatic because even if it's almost a subconscious movement. If I throw a ball at your face and you reach up and catch it, that part of that's reflex, but part of that is the subconscious part of the somatic nervous system, but it's still a voluntary movement. And these nerves from this are going to connect to the skeletal muscles, the muscles responsible for movement. We're going to look at spinal nerves and cranial nerves as part of this. The other part of the peripheral nervous system is the autonomic nervous system. Now, the autonomic nervous system is the involuntary portion of the nervous system. So these nerves connect to what are referred to as the smooth muscles. The smooth muscles are the muscles for things that we are not voluntarily moving, like the heart. The cardiac muscles, the glands, these various different things that we are not consciously aware of, that we are not willing to move, they move on their own. Some other smooth muscles is like things under the skin for things like goosebumps and stuff like that. So these various different things that we don't voluntarily control, they are involuntarily controlled. And this is there's two components of the autonomic nervous system. There is the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. The sympathetic, and we'll talk about this more later, refers more to activation. The parasympathetic refers more to deactivation. That's not a complete and total whole of the explanation, but that is the easiest way to explain it. So let's look at the major divisions of the peripheral nervous system. So for the somatic, over here, you've got the spinal nerves, the afferents from the sense organs, so the incoming information from the sense organs, the efferents to the muscles, so the outgoing information to the muscles, the cranial nerves, the afferents from the sense organs in the skull, and the efferents to the muscles in the skull, with the exception of the eyes, which is part of the brain. But we'll come back to that when we're talking about the brain, because the eyes are one exception. The eyes are basically classified as part of the brain, so they are part of the central nervous system. The rest is all the peripheral nervous system. How about the autonomic? You've got the sympathetic branch, which involves spinal nerves and the sympathetic ganglia. And then you've got the parasympathetic, which involves cranial nerves and spinal nerves, as well as the parasympathetic ganglia. Let's start by talking about the spinal nerves. So I've been talking about the spinal nerves a few times. I've been talking about spinal and cranial nerves. So spinal nerves are in both the somatic and the autonomic, but in the somatic, they're what is basically working with the body, and in the autonomic, they're part of the sympathetic. And well, actually, they're part of both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. But when we talk about the next thing in just a minute, when we talk about cranial nerves are part of the somatic, but in the autonomic, they're only part of the parasympathetic. So, spinal nerves are nerves that leave the vertebral column, so they leave the spine, and travel to the I can talk today, yeah. They travel to the muscles and the sensory receptors that they innervate, that they supply, and they branch out repeatedly as they go away from the spine. So there's more and more branches. There's actually, when we look at this, there's 31 paired sets of dorsal and ventral roots attached to the 31 spinal nerves. So there are 31 spinal nerves, and then there are dorsal and ventral roots that are attached to those that come off. You see here you've got the dorsal root and the ventral root, and you've got 31 of these. The dorsal root up here is responsible for sensory and afferent neurons that take information to the central nervous system. The ventral root is for motor and efferent neurons that take information away from the central nervous system. So this is in a direction to, this is in a direction away. And again, the afferent neurons, they bring information in. The efferent neurons send information out. And I just explained that the dorsal is afferent. So you see that there's this dorsal and afferent. The ventral is efferent. Let's look next at the cranial nerves. So the cranial nerves are fun. There are 12 cranial nerves. There are actually 12 pairs of cranial nerves, one on each side. And these cranial nerves, they basically come from the upper part of the spinal cord, at the tip of the spinal cord, the hindbrain. We'll talk about that in a bit. And these branch off and go to various different places. So the first that you see here, so we're going to go from top to bottom and go counterclockwise. So the first that you see here at the top is the olfactory nerve, the olfactory cranial nerve. This is responsible for smell. The next is the optic. It is the first one relating to the eyes, and the optic nerve is related to vision. Next, we're going to have 3, 4, and 6. So we're going to skip 5 and go to 6. We've got 3, 4, and 6 are all responsible for basically eye movement in different directions. So we have a lot that relates to eyes. This is important because our eyes need to move fast for survival. Your eyes are actually always moving. We'll talk about that when we talk about vision later with saccades and how your eyes are always moving. So these 3 nerves are for the eyes. Then we go back to 5. We've got for pain, touch, and the jaw muscles. So we're back to 5. So 7 here and 9 here are kind of interrelated in that they are responsible for things relating to taste. So 7 is the facial, and this is the face muscles and taste. 9 is the glossopharyngeal. I can talk today. Again, I've said it before. Sometimes I have trouble saying some of these. But this is responsible for taste as well. But now instead of the face muscles, it's the throat and larynx muscles. 8 is the auditory, and that is going to be responsible for hearing. 10 is the vagus. The vagus nerve is responsible for the internal organs. So the vagus nerve it's an important one. The 11th one is basically for the neck muscles, and then the 12th one is for tongue movement. So another one to do with the mouth. So you see a lot of these have to do with the eyes and mouth, but some are still dealing with things like the jaws, even down to the internal organs, all of those types of things. Now let's switch to the autonomic nervous system and talk about that for a minute. So the autonomic nervous system is going to be basically dealing with the regulation of the smooth muscles, the cardiac muscles, and the glands. These are things that are not dealing with like conscious effort. So when you talk about digestion, you don't have to think about digestion. Your body already does that. You don't have to think about breathing. You can circumvent it and control breathing and hold your breath and make yourself breathe and stuff like that. But for the most part, your breathing is autonomic. The dilation of the pupils, it happens automatically. The heart, all of the process of digestion and bladder and the stimulation of the sexual organs. These are all part of the autonomic nervous system, and they are all part of basically involuntary things. And again, the sympathetic nervous system is the activation, is the easiest way to say it. It's what gets you going. It's responsible for quick energy mobilization. It's what some refer to as what gets you ready for fight, flight, or freeze. So it is what is the activity part, the energizing part of the autonomic nervous system. The opposite of that is the parasympathetic sympathetic nervous system, the part that calms you down, that brings you back to normal, that takes you and is more responsible for conservation of energy. So both of these work together throughout your day depending on the arousals you have in your environment. So let's look at those a little bit more. The sympathetic division controls functions that accompany arousal, expenditure of energy, fight, flight, or freeze response to stressors. These are the things like when you eat, your sympathetic starts to activate to expend energy to digest food, things like that. It causes your heart rate to increase. It causes you to breathe faster. It can actually cause in situations for different reasons. It can cause your digestion system to slow down. Why does it do that? Because it's dedicating resources to other things. But the point is your sympathetic nervous system, it's not a universal, the whole body goes or the whole body stops. It can be certain parts of the body that are going. Parasympathetic works the same way too. You can have parts of the body that are stopping or slowing down because it's involved with increases in body supply of stored energy. It coordinates rest and relax after the body has been stressed. But like I said, you can have different parts of the body in sympathetic and different parts of the body in parasympathetic, though typically it's more of a universal whole. Okay, like I said, relatively short set of slides. I could have gone over every single one of the terms in that half, and then this lecture would have been more than twice as long, and you would have been more than twice as bored. We covered the planes and orientation of the brain. We looked at the central nervous system and the meninges. We looked at the ventricles. We looked at the spinal cord. We looked at the peripheral nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. And then in the next lecture, we will talk about the brain. Thanks. Come on back.